out here in the untamed Texas Panhandle, a man's worth was measured by his word, his iron, and his horse. When a desperate shadow slipped into the Broken Anvil Ranch and stole Caleb McCall's prized stallion, she signed her own death warrant. Or so he thought. The autumn winds of 1887 howled across the sweeping plains near Tascosa, Texas, carrying the bitter promise of an early winter. At the Broken Anvil Ranch, life was dictated by the rising sun and the grueling demands of 5,000 head of cattle. The foreman, Caleb McCall, was a man carved from the very landscape he worked, hard, unforgiving, and deeply weathered. He was a man of few words, preferring the loyal company of his prized blue-roan stallion, Ironclad. Ironclad was more than a horse. He was a local legend. Standing full hands higher than any standard Mustang in the Panhandle, the roan possessed the speed of a quarter horse and the endurance of a desert predator. Caleb had broken the stallion himself, surviving 3 broken ribs and a fractured collarbone in the process. A bond forged in sweat and dust tied the man to the beast, an unspoken understanding that no one else could ride the roan. But desperate times breed desperate courage. Josephine Caldwell was out of time, out of money, and completely out of options. Just 3 weeks prior, her younger brother, Thomas, had been caught running a rigged card game in the back room of Sadie Jenkins's saloon. Unfortunately for Thomas, the man he swindled was Beauregard Montgomery, a ruthless cattle baron who owned half the county and had the local law enforcement sitting comfortably in his tailored pockets. Montgomery didn't want the money back. He wanted the Caldwell family's prime riverfront acreage. When Josephine refused to sign the deed, Montgomery took Thomas as collateral, promising the boy would swing from a cottonwood tree by the end of the month if the deed wasn't surrendered. Josephine knew she couldn't fight Montgomery's small army of hired guns. Her only play was to buy her brother back with something Montgomery coveted more than their land. For months, Montgomery had obsessively tried to purchase Ironclad from Caleb McCall, offering exorbitant sums of gold, only to be flatly rejected. If Josephine could deliver the legendary blue roan to Montgomery's estate, she could trade the beast for her brother's life. On a moonless Tuesday night, Josephine dressed in Thomas's oversized denim trousers, a heavy canvas duster, and a pulled-down Stetson. She smeared charcoal across her cheeks to blend into the darkness and approached the Broken Anvil. She was no stranger to horses. Her father had been a skilled farrier before the cholera took him. She knew how to move with the wind, how to step so the dry brush wouldn't crack beneath her boots. Slipping into the main barn, the air was thick with the scent of sweet hay, leather, and manure. Ironclad was in the furthest stall, his massive silhouette shifting in the dark. He snorted, a low, rumbling warning as Josephine approached. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice a soft, trembling melody. She didn't bring a rope. She knew a horse like this would fight a forced capture. Instead, she brought a handful of dried apples coated in molasses. She held her hand flat, keeping her breathing steady, masking her own terror. Ironclad stamped a heavy hoof, but the sweet scent caught his attention. He nudged her palm, his velvet muzzle taking the offering. Working with practiced, terrifying speed, she slipped a hackamore over his head, forgoing the heavy saddle that would surely make too much noise. She led him out through the rear paddock, avoiding the bunkhouse where 20 armed ranch hands slept. It wasn't until she was a full mile past the property line that she hauled herself onto Ironclad's bare back, dug her heels in, and urged the massive beast into a dead sprint toward the Canadian river breaks. Dawn broke over the Broken Anvil like a cracked egg, spilling harsh orange light across the frost-bitten grass. Caleb McCall stood in front of the empty stall, his jaw clenched so tight A muscle ticked violently in his cheek. The heavy iron latch hadn't been broken. It had been carefully unhooked. Sheriff Emmett Clark, who had ridden out for his weekly coffee at the ranch, leaned against the barn door, chewing on a piece of straw. Could be a drifter, Caleb. Or maybe Comancheros slipped south. Let it go. The horse is halfway to New Mexico by now. Caleb knelt, running a gloved hand over the dirt. He studied the footprints left behind by the thief. They were small, the boots lacking the heavy, uneven wear of a seasoned cowpoke. No drifter steals a horse, bareback with a pocket full of molasses, Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew the dog wouldn't bark if they moved quiet. You ain't going after them alone, Emmett warned. You don't know who you're riding into. I know I'm getting my horse back, Caleb replied, standing up and brushing the dirt from his denim trousers. He strapped his heavy Colt .45 to his thigh and grabbed his Winchester repeater from the tack room. And whoever took him is going to learn that stealing from me is the last mistake they'll ever make. Within the hour, Caleb was mounted on a sturdy bay gelding, tracking the deep, unmistakable hoofprints of the massive blue roan. The trail led northeast, straight into the rugged, treacherous terrain of the Canadian River Breaks, a lawless stretch of canyons and ravines where desperate people went to disappear. Caleb's pale eyes narrowed against the harsh wind. He was hunting a ghost, but he was a patient man, and he was bringing hell with him. The Canadian River Breaks were a jagged scar across the Texas landscape, a labyrinth of red dirt, sharp mesquite, and plunging drop-offs. For 12 hours, Caleb tracked the blue roan. The sheer weight of the horse made the trail relatively easy to follow, but Caleb's seasoned eyes noticed something perplexing. The tracks indicated a rider who was incredibly light in the saddle, shifting their weight perfectly with the terrain to preserve the horse's energy. Whoever stole Ironclad wasn't just a thief, they were an exceptional equestrian. By late afternoon, the shadows began to stretch like long, dark fingers across the canyon floor. Caleb dismounted to examine a patch of freshly overturned earth. The roan had skidded here, turning sharply. He touched the edge of a hoofprint. The dirt was still crumbling. He was less than 20 minutes behind. A mile ahead, Josephine was realizing that the Canadian Breaks were a death trap. Ironclad was magnificent, navigating the treacherous shale and narrow ridges with powerful grace. But Josephine's arms ached from the sheer force required to guide the massive animal without a bit. Her water canteen was empty, and her brother's boots were rubbing blisters into her heels. She guided the roan down into a narrow ravine, hoping to find a hidden creek bed. Instead, she found the devil waiting. Beauregard Montgomery had never been a man to wait patiently for a deal to conclude. Trusting a desperate girl to deliver the finest horse in the state was a fool's gamble, and Montgomery was no fool. He had dispatched his most ruthless enforcer, a scarred tracker named Levi Hobbs, along with 4 heavily armed men, to intercept Josephine before she could change her mind or get caught by the law. As Josephine rode into the clearing, Hobbs and his men stepped out from behind a cluster of massive boulders, rifles raised. "Well, well," Hobbs drawled, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the red dust. "Look what the little bird dragged in. Montgomery's going to be mighty pleased you did the heavy lifting, girl." Josephine yanked back on the reins, Ironclad rearing up, sensing the sudden hostility. "We had a deal," she shouted, her voice echoing off the canyon walls, trying to sound much braver than she felt. "I bring the horse to the estate, and Montgomery releases Thomas." Hobbs chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "The deal changed, honey. The boss figured it's easier to just take the horse here. No witnesses, no loose ends, and certainly no need to hand back that prime riverfront land." He cocked his Winchester. "Get off the horse. Slowly." Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the 4 rifles pointed at her chest. If they killed her and took the horse, Thomas was dead anyway. She tightened her grip on the hackamore. She wasn't going to die in this dust. "Higher!" she screamed, driving her heels into Ironclad's flanks. The blue roan exploded forward, surging like a locomotive straight toward the men on the left. Gunfire erupted, the deafening cracks echoing through the canyon. Josephine flattened herself against Ironclad's neck as a bullet tore through the fabric of her duster. High up on the canyon ridge, Caleb had just crested the hill when the gunfire shattered the silence. He dropped to his stomach, peering over the ledge. Down below, he saw his prized blue roan plunging through the brush, carrying a slight, frantic rider. He also saw 5 men on horseback, spurring their mounts to give chase, rifles blazing. Caleb didn't care who the rider was. Nobody was putting a bullet in his horse. Pulling his Winchester to his shoulder, Caleb took a slow, steady breath. He led the foremost pursuer, adjusted for the wind funneling through the gorge, and squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of Caleb's rifle cut through the chaos. Hobbs's lead man let out a sharp cry as Caleb's bullet struck his saddle horn, showering him in wood splinters and causing his horse to buck violently. The sudden sniper fire from above threw Montgomery's men into disarray. "Up on the ridge!" Hobbs bellowed, returning fire wildly. Caleb racked the lever of his rifle, firing twice more, dropping the horse of another pursuer, forcing the men to scramble for cover behind the boulders. Down in the canyon, Ironclad leaped over a fallen cottonwood, but the loose shale on the landing gave way. The horse stumbled, going to his knees. The sudden stop launched Josephine over the animal's head. She hit the ground hard, tumbling through the brutal mesquite brush. Caleb cursed under his breath. He scrambled down the steep embankment, sliding in the dirt, his revolver drawn. He reached the canyon floor just as Hobbs and his remaining 2 men cautiously advanced, their guns trained on the fallen rider. "Back off!" Caleb's voice roared through the dust, his Colt leveled squarely at Hobbs's chest. "That's my horse, and you boys are trespassing on a bad day." Hobbs sneered, recognizing the broken anvil foreman. "McCall, this ain't your fight. We just want the horse, and the thief. The horse goes with me. The thief goes to the sheriff," Caleb stated, stepping between the men and the fallen rider. Behind Caleb, Josephine groaned, pushing herself up from the dirt. Her oversized Stetson had been knocked clean off in the fall. As she sat up, a cascade of thick, auburn hair tumbled down around her shoulders, framing a face streaked with dirt, sweat, and a fresh cut across her cheekbone. She looked up, her piercing green eyes locking onto Caleb's hardened gaze. Caleb froze. The desperate, hardened thief he had been tracking for 12 hours, the phantom who had expertly stolen his prize stallion in the dead of night, was a woman. And not just any woman. He recognized the fierce, defiant glare of the Caldwell girl from town. "McCall, don't be a hero," Hobbs warned, raising his rifle. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you." Caleb didn't look away from Josephine. He saw the sheer terror mixed with iron resolve in her eyes. He had come here to exact vengeance on a horse thief. Instead, he found himself standing between a desperate woman and a firing squad. With a lightning-fast motion, Caleb grabbed Josephine by the collar of her duster, hauling her to her feet and shoving her behind the massive frame of the recovering Ironclad. "Get on!" he barked at her. "Kill 'em both!" Hobbs screamed. Caleb spun, firing his Colt 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy point .45 slugs kicked up geysers of red dust right at the men's feet, forcing them to dive for cover. He didn't wait to see if he hit anything. He vaulted onto his bay gelding, grabbed Ironclad's lead rope, and spurred his horse hard. "Hold on to him!" Caleb yelled over his shoulder to Josephine, who was clinging desperately to the roan's mane. Gunfire tore through the brush behind them, as Caleb led Josephine and the two horses into the deepest, narrowest cut of the Canadian breaks, disappearing into the shadows as the sun finally sank below the rim of the world. The thief was in his custody. His horse was safe. But as Caleb glanced back at the girl riding his prized stallion, he knew the real trouble had only just begun. The relentless, unforgiving geography of the Canadian River breaks provided the perfect labyrinth for a seasoned tracker like Caleb McCall to lose their pursuers. For hours they navigated through narrow gorges and dry, winding arroyos until Caleb finally halted the horses in a shallow, naturally concealed limestone overhang just north of Plum Creek. The temperature was plummeting, the wind carrying the sharp, biting promise of a panhandle frost. Caleb dismounted, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. He tied his bay gelding to a twisted mesquite root before stepping toward Ironclad. The massive blue roan snorted, exhausted, but calm. Josephine slipped down from the bare back of the stallion, her legs trembling from the sheer physical toll of gripping the beast for hours. She leaned against the limestone wall, her breath visible in the frigid night air. For a long moment, the only sound was the howling wind and the shifting hooves of the horses. Caleb struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the harsh planes of his face. He lit a small pile of dry sage and buffalo chips, keeping the fire deliberately low to avoid a smoke plume. Only when the small flames stabilized did he turn his pale, piercing eyes toward her. "You're a long way from the settlement, Miss Caldwell," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the cramped space. "And you've got a hell of a lot of explaining to do. A horse thief in these parts swings from a rope, woman or not. So you better start talking, and it better be the absolute truth." Josephine hugged her canvas duster tighter around her shoulders, refusing to cower under his withering gaze. "I didn't steal him for money, Mr. McCall. I stole him for my brother's life." Slowly, the dam broke. Josephine poured out the desperate reality of her situation. She detailed Thomas's foolish card game, Beauregard Montgomery's ruthless extortion, and the ticking clock on her brother's execution. "Montgomery doesn't care about a rigged poker hand," she spat, her green eyes flashing with defiant tears she refused to shed. "He wants our land. He wants the riverfront. If I didn't bring him the one thing his gold couldn't buy, your blue roan, Thomas was going to die by sunrise tomorrow." Caleb crouched by the fire, a heavy silence settling over him. He knew Montgomery was a greedy, land-hungry baron who had forced out half the homesteaders near Tascosa. But this was a new level of brazen criminality. "Your land sits right at the choke point of the Canadian River," Caleb muttered, his mind working through the tactical implications. He picked up a stick, drawing a rough map in the dirt. "If Montgomery takes your acreage, he controls the primary water access. He's not just squeezing you, Josephine. Charles Goodnight down at the J.A. Ranch warned us about men like him. If Montgomery dams that riverfront, he cuts off the winter water supply for the Broken Anvil. He's plotting to starve out our 5,000 head of cattle and bankrupt my boss." Josephine stared at the dirt map, realization dawning. "By stealing your horse, I inadvertently dragged you into a range war." "We were already in it," Caleb corrected, tossing the stick into the fire. "Montgomery was just using your brother to fire the first shot without drawing the law. But now he's got a problem. I know his play." Before Josephine could respond, a sharp, unnatural crack echoed from the ridge above them. Caleb's instincts took over in a fraction of a second. "Down!" he roared, lunging across the fire and tackling Josephine to the gravel, just as a volley of rifle fire shattered the limestone wall behind them, raining sharp rock shards down on their heads. Levi Hobbs hadn't lost their trail after all. The scarred tracker had used the moonlight to follow the heavy impressions of Ironclad's hooves. "Flush 'em out!" Hobbs's voice barked from the darkness above. Caleb rolled off Josephine, drawing his Colt 45 in one fluid motion while grabbing his Winchester with his left hand. "Stay down and keep the horses calm," he ordered over the deafening gunfire. He scrambled toward the edge of the overhang, using a heavy boulder for cover. Two of Montgomery's men were advancing down the steep embankment, their silhouettes momentarily visible against the starlit sky. Caleb levered his rifle, fired, and watched the man on the right tumble backward into the brush with a sharp cry. But Hobbs was a seasoned killer. He had flanked the overhang. As Caleb adjusted his position to fire again, Hobbs emerged from the shadows to the left, his six-shooter leveled. A deafening crack rang out. Caleb felt a blinding, white-hot agony tear through his left shoulder. The impact spun him around, throwing him violently against the cavern wall. His rifle clattered to the dirt. "Caleb!" Josephine screamed. Hobbs stepped fully into the dim light of the dying fire, a wicked grin splitting his scarred face. He cocked his revolver, aiming it squarely at Caleb's chest. "End of the line, McCall." Hobbs never got to pull the trigger. Josephine had grabbed Caleb's dropped Winchester. She didn't know how to shoot with the precision of a cowboy, but she didn't need to. She pointed the barrel directly at Hobbs and pulled the trigger. The heavy recoil threw her backward, but the bullet tore through Hobbs's thigh, dropping the massive enforcer to his knees with a howl of agony. "Get up!" Josephine shouted, scrambling to her feet and hauling Caleb up by his uninjured right arm. Blood was already soaking through the thick denim of Caleb's shirt, but adrenaline fueled his movements. With Hobbs writhing on the ground and his remaining man retreating up the ridge, Josephine shoved Caleb toward his bay gelding. "Can you ride?" she demanded, her voice stripped of all fear, replaced only by pure survival instinct. "I'll manage," Caleb gritted out, his face pale with shock. He hauled himself into the saddle, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Josephine swung onto Ironclad. She didn't look back as they spurred the horses, galloping wildly into the pitch-black moor of the canyon, leaving Hobbs bleeding in the dirt. They had survived the night, but the dawn was coming, and Beauregard Montgomery still had her brother. Dawn bled across the Texas horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and bruised purple. 10 miles outside the sprawling gates of the Montgomery estate, Josephine and Caleb took refuge in an abandoned line shack. Caleb sat heavily on an overturned wooden crate, his teeth clenched in agony as Josephine tightly bound his wounded shoulder with strips of her torn canvas duster. She had cleaned the through-and-through bullet hole with a splash of whiskey from Caleb's flask, her hands remarkably steady despite the blood coating her fingers. "You're a stubborn fool, McCall," she murmured, tying off the makeshift bandage. "You should be heading back to the Broken Anvil to fetch your 20 ranch hands and the sheriff." "No time," Caleb rasped, his breathing shallow, but his pale eyes burning with an intense, unyielding fire. He looked up at her, really looking at her. The dirt smudged across her cheek, the fierce intelligence in her gaze, the absolute refusal to surrender. He had spent his life valuing the loyalty of horses over people, but the woman standing in front of him possessed a courage that rivaled the wildest Mustang he had ever broken. "Montgomery expects Hobbs to return with the horse and your corpse. When Hobbs doesn't show, Montgomery will cut his losses and hang your brother to make an example. We hit him now, while he thinks he's holding all the cards." "We?" Josephine asked, her voice softening, a sudden, undeniable warmth blooming in her chest. "This isn't your fight anymore, Caleb. You have your horse back." Caleb reached up with his good right hand, his rough, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of auburn hair behind her ear. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through them both. "You stole my horse, Josie," he said softly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But I think you ended up stealing something a hell of a lot more valuable. I'm not letting you ride in there alone." The Montgomery estate was a fortress of arrogance, built with imported lumber and surrounded by high wrought-iron fences. Heavily armed sentries patrolled the wraparound porch. In the center of the dusty courtyard, a gruesome sight awaited. A thick hangman's noose dangled from the sturdy branch of an ancient live oak tree. Beneath it, a battered and bruised Thomas Caldwell sat tied to a wooden chair, a burlap sack resting on the dirt beside him. Beauregard Montgomery stood on the porch, a gold pocket watch in his manicured hand, his patience entirely exhausted. "String him up," Montgomery ordered his men, snapping the watch shut. "Hobbs failed. I'll take the land over the Caldwell boy's dead body." Two men moved to hoist Thomas to his feet, but a sudden shout from the front gate halted them. Riding slowly through the wrought-iron archway, perched magnificently upon the legendary blue roan, was Josephine Caldwell. She sat tall, her posture radiating an authority that belied her terror. Beside her, slumped forward in the saddle of a bay gelding and wearing an oversized hat pulled low over his face, appeared to be a captive man with his hands bound. Montgomery's cruel eyes lit up with greedy triumph at the sight of Ironclad. "Well, I'll be damned. The little bird actually pulled it off. And she brought me McCall as a prisoner." Josephine halted Ironclad 20 yards from the porch. "I brought you the horse, Montgomery, and I brought you the man who tried to stop me. Now let my brother go." Montgomery laughed, descending the porch steps. "You're in no position to negotiate, sweetheart, but I am a man of my word. Take the reins, boys." Two guards stepped forward to grab Ironclad. It was the mistake Caleb had been waiting for. With lightning speed, the bound captive on the bay gelding kicked away the fake ropes. Caleb McCall threw off the oversized hat, sitting bolt upright. Despite his wounded left shoulder, his right hand was a blur of deadly precision. He drew his Colt .45 and fired twice before the guards even registered the trap. Both men dropped to the dirt, clutching their knees, howling in pain. Chaos erupted in the courtyard. "Kill them!" Montgomery shrieked, scrambling backward up the porch steps. Josephine dug her heels into Ironclad, steering the massive beast directly toward the hanging tree. The remaining guards raised their rifles. But Caleb laid down a blistering cover fire, fanning the hammer of his Colt with terrifying accuracy, splintering the porch pillars and forcing Montgomery's men to dive for the dirt. As Josephine reached the tree, she drew the hunting knife Caleb had lent her and slashed through the ropes binding her brother. "Thomas, get up!" she screamed, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him onto the back of the roan behind her. From the balcony above, a guard took aim at Josephine's back. Caleb saw it, but his revolver clicked empty. He had no time to reload. Suddenly, a deafening roar echoed across the courtyard, entirely separate from the chaotic gunfight. A shotgun blast tore through the balcony railing, sending the sniper tumbling over the edge. Sheriff Emmett Clark rode through the gates, flanked by 10 heavily armed deputies and a posse of broken Anvil Ranch hands. "Drop your weapons," Emmett bellowed, pumping his shotgun. "Every last one of you." The sheer force of the law's arrival drained the fight from Montgomery's hired guns. They dropped their rifles, raising their hands in surrender. Montgomery himself was cornered on the porch by 3 furious deputies. Emmett rode up to Caleb, eyeing the bloody bandage on his shoulder. "Figured you might need a hand, McCall. Found the trail of bodies you left in the breaks. You've been a busy man." Caleb holstered his empty Colt, his eyes fixed on the center of the courtyard. Josephine was sliding off Ironclad, embracing her battered but alive younger brother, tears finally streaming down her dirt-streaked face. The battle for the riverfront was over. Montgomery would rot in a federal penitentiary for extortion and attempted murder, and the Caldwell land, along with the Broken Anvil's water supply, was safe. Later that evening, as the dust settled and the medical doctor from Tascosa finished stitching Caleb's shoulder, Josephine walked into the Broken Anvil barn. Caleb was standing by Ironclad's stall, feeding the massive beast a handful of molasses-coated apples. Josephine stepped beside him, gently resting her hand on the wooden gate. "We owe you our lives, Caleb. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Caleb turned to her, his harsh exterior completely melted away, leaving only the rugged, honest man beneath. He reached out, his strong hand warmly engulfing hers. "You don't owe me a thing, Josie. But I reckon the Broken Anvil could use a permanent farrier who knows her way around a horse. And I could use you." Josephine smiled, a bright, beautiful expression that lit up the dimly lit barn. She leaned into him, resting her head against his uninjured chest, the steady rhythm of his heart beating against her cheek. She had ridden into the dark to steal a horse, but she had captured the wildest, truest heart in Texas. Caleb McCall kept his prized blue roan, but the fearless woman who stole it ended up capturing his rugged heart. Today, their legacy lives on as a testament to untamed love in the wild Texas frontier. Did this thrilling frontier romance capture your imagination? If you want more untamed stories of the Wild West, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel.